Now, when it comes to discovering vulnerabilities in web applications, the main concept or the main idea that I usually teach my students, even in my website hacking course where we do everything manually, is to go ahead and use the websites and access all the links that you gathered in the information gathering stage. And then every time you see a variable or an input that's being sent to the web application, to the web server, try to manipulate this input and modify it to test for all the vulnerabilities that you learn. So the main idea is, if we go back to the diagram of how a website works, you can see that the user usually make requests. The requests get executed by the web application on the web server, and the response is returned to the user. Now, some requests contain data that get used by the web application. So what we usually do is we manipulate this data and try to send some malicious code or malicious payloads in order to exploit some kind of vulnerability. Now, usually data is sent to the web server using two main concepts. The first one is through the URL, and you'd usually see the file name that the data is being sent to, followed by a parameter, so you can think of this as a variable, and followed by the value, which is 1 in this example. Sometimes you actually don't see the file name and you only see the value, which is 1 in here. We don't really care about the file name. If we see the value, then we can manipulate this data, and instead of sending 1, we can send payloads to test for SQL injection, XSS, and other vulnerabilities. The second form of sending data to a web server or to the web application is through input boxes. So we've seen search boxes and checkboxes before on websites, and every time you fill this with data, this data gets sent to the web application. Now, in most cases, in this example, the data will be sent through POST, and therefore you will not see the data in the URL. You only see the data in the URL if it's being sent using the GET method. So let me show you a quick example. Right here, I have a page on Facebook, and if you look at the URL, you'll see that there is a parameter called reftype, and the value for this parameter is registration form. So basically, when you access this link, your browser or you send to the Facebook web application a value called registration form. Now, Facebook's web application is going to use this value somewhere in their code. So it's similar to the way when we write functions, for example, and they take a variable and then we use the variable somewhere in our code. This is exactly what Facebook's web application is doing. It's actually taking this value and it's using it somewhere in their code. So we as hackers usually try to, instead of sending these values as is, as the default values that the web application expects, we usually manipulate this and send values that allow us to discover a number of vulnerabilities. Now, the values that we send depend on the vulnerability that we're trying to discover, but we always follow the same concept. We manipulate the inputs and analyze the output to see if the web application is vulnerable, and if it is, we will exploit it again using the same idea. So instead of sending code to discover the vulnerability, we will send code to exploit the vulnerability. Now, like I said, this is the first common way of sending data to the web application from the user from the web browser. The second way is, like I said, using text boxes. So right here, this is actually a vulnerable web page on my Metasploitable machine. I'm accessing it using the IP of the Metasploitable machine. And if you just go to /Matilde and go to OWASP top 10, cross-site scripting, reflected, and DNS lookup, you will actually get this page. And this page actually does send some data over the URL using GET, but at the same time, it contains an input box. Now, you can put any value that you want in this input box, similar to the way you can manipulate this value in here. And therefore, when testing for vulnerabilities, you should always test these text boxes for the same vulnerabilities that you would test the parameters that you see in the URL. Now, we've seen before how to discover all the URLs in a page, and then using what we learned in Python, we can manipulate these URLs and send anything that we want. So we really have nothing to cover there. We will cover how to use that to automatically discover vulnerabilities in GET requests or in parameters later on in the course. The main thing that we haven't covered now is how to actually discover the forms in a page. So we covered how to fill values for forms and submit them before, but using Python, if I just give a page or a link to my Python program, it's not able to discover whether this page contains any forms or not. And even if we manage to do that, we need to also discover all the inputs and the button so that we can actually submit this form. Because before, when I showed you how to submit a form, we manually filled up the names for the inputs and the location where the form should be submitted. So we can't really use that in an automatic program to automatically discover vulnerabilities throughout these forms. So, in the next lecture, I'm going to show you how to extract forms from any HTML page and extract all the useful data from this form so that we can use it later on in our program to automatically discover vulnerabilities that can be exploited through these forms.